passed away today. In 2024, Laquan was honored for his contributions in the sphere of national service, energy, and steel plant innovation, as he tearfully accepted the Order of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at President's House, Satan. A Port of Spain businesswoman has been charged with 2 counts of fraud following an investigation by the fraud squad. According to reports, in April 2024, the 30-year-old businesswoman allegedly purchased a quantity of alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages valued at $122,262 from a supplier, for which she issued 2 checks, one for $51,991 and another for $70,271. The checks were accepted as payment. However, upon deposit, both were returned dishonored. Attempts to recover the outstanding sum were unsuccessful, prompting the supplier to make a formal report. The businesswoman was granted $100,000 bail by a Justice of the Peace on April the 3rd and is scheduled to appear before Port of Spain magistrate on April the 30th. 46-year-old abducted victim, Trinidad-born British citizen Zahir Isat, is still missing. Isat, who is in Trinidad visiting his parents, was snatched by a gunman on Friday in Cunupia. He owns a private school for troubled children at Lewis Carlton Brook Hunting Court, Leicestershire. Isat, his father and brother-in-law, just left the Digicel mosque and was in a black Nissan Note driving along Warren Road. When they got near the Southern Main Road intersection around 1:50 p.m., a vehicle blocked their path and an occupant armed with a rifle approached and ordered them to lower their heads. He then forced Isat from the back seat and into the other vehicle. Isat did not have his phone in his possession, police said. The Anti-Kidnapping Unit and Central Division Police are investigating. 3 persons were arrested and 11 fixed penalty notices were issued during a roving stop-and-search traffic enforcement operation between 8 p.m. on April the 5th, 2025 and 1 a.m. on 6th of April 2025. Officers conducted the exercise along the Churchill-Roosevelt Highway and Uriah Butler Highway. During the operation, 3 individuals were arrested, a 60-year-old and a 53-year-old for driving with a breath alcohol level exceeding the legal prescribed limit, and a 23-year-old for driving without a driver's permit and a valid certificate of insurance. Well, that's news on the hour on WESN. I'm Sean Michael Small. Thanks for watching.
WESN.
Another figure has passed on in our nation. Prayers and condolences to the family. It's just one of those things where we have to remember that just because something so important that it seemingly is overriding much of the discussion of our society doesn't mean that life in other aspects stop. It was a similar situation with COVID where some people allowed that issue to override concerns in other aspects of health. And perhaps that has contributed to some of the health issues post-COVID. And now that we have an election, and I guess it's based on your perception how important this election would be. There's a part of me that wants to say this is a turning point election, but there's another part of me that wants to say, well, this is an election, and they're all important. To what extent should we not forget there are other aspects of society, not just the politicking? Because I would argue that the issues at times are lost in the politics. And a couple of stories, from an article from today from one of the daily newspapers, and then another one from earlier on in the week that has a continuation, I believe. To what extent do our politicians get caught up in politicking as opposed to what politics actually is supposed to mean, which will then go more towards governing? 3 weeks from a general election, today's Guardian has an article sourcing the opinions of political analyst Derek Ramsamouj. And he said it's the most historic. 17 parties, 161 candidates. And the main point of the article is to highlight his opinion that it seems as though with all these parties and all these potential candidates of different allegiances, the votes might be split, but it might be split in a way to help the incumbent, which is interesting. Because, yes, there are other parties contesting PNM seats, but those are safe seats. So, to some extent, no one has offered a scenario or vision of events where safe seats of either side really are up for grabs. So then we're talking about the contested seats. So you have to ask yourself, do I think that the multiple parties in the contested seats will steal votes from the UNC more than the PNM? Because when we look at the parties, the PEP is not really contesting seats in competition with the UNC, and the TPP obviously is not contesting seats in competition with the UNC. The UNC has absolutely no presence in Tobago through no small fault of their own. So we're left with parties like the NTA and the Patriotic Front contesting seats that the UNC has. And just based off of the obvious assumptions, one would think they would take votes more from the UNC than the PNM. In the case of the NTA, I'm not entirely sure. And this might be one of those things where now, if the voter numbers actually increase, the undecided voters might actually split, and those who are anti-PNM might go to the third party, but those who are pro-PNM, of course, they don't have an alternative. You don't have a third party alternative to pro-PNM, pro the incumbent, so they'll just go to the incumbent. And I could see where Mr. Ramsamouj is coming from. He pointed out, one of the things that he pointed out, well, first he spoke about the NTA political leader, Gary Griffith, and a flaw that he sees in Gary Griffith's campaigning, which is basically, I did. But to some extent, the other two main parties in the race, a lot of what they're doing is what we did. In the case of the PNM, in the last 9 to 10 years. In the case of the UNC, what the UNC did when it was in power, as though the partnership disappeared. Stricken from the record, right? Now, that could be just a slip of the tongue or a Freudian slip. That's not important. The point is, it's not just Gary Griffith who's saying what I did. And to some extent, the other parties are, I would argue, a little bit worse, because a lot of what the UNC is implying to propose is hinged on its track record based on a different set of circumstances 10 years ago. And to what extent are they making a mistake trying to imply that we could get you back to 10 years ago when oil and gas revenues and oil and gas production is nowhere near what it was 10 years ago? So to what extent are those promises a bit empty? Meanwhile, the PNM has the reverse problem. Every time they try to move off from what we did and go towards what we will do, the obvious question that keeps hitting them in the face is, well, why didn't you do it already? Part of it could be with regards to budgetary restrictions, but they did not manage the communication of how they were limited by government revenue or liquidity in order to carry out certain things, and choices had to be made, and some things couldn't have been done. In part because I'm sure there are a lot of decisions that people will question, why did you all spend money on this? And didn't do the things that you're now promising you're going to do when you could have done it all the time if they were so popular. And then the long and short is, ironically, the NTA might be the only party that at least isn't necessarily making political promises where we have to question, could you actually keep them? Not that Guy Griffith has a whole set of manifesto. I believe he said he's not going to have a manifesto. So, and to some extent, that may be a disadvantageous position to put yourself in, but who knows, right? Part of the academic analysis of the situation will have to happen in hindsight, because no one could really tell how the public is going to respond. If we could, we wouldn't need the election in the first place. We'll just, declare the winner and move on. But what was more telling was Mr. Ramsmooge, his analysis on Michaela Pandey. Basically calling her out for not necessarily making any sort of name for herself for the last 10 years, which is a criticism that I have heard of before, I have had myself, and at this point, it makes me wonder how serious to take her party and her candidacy. She's going up for her father's old seat. She talks like a father, sounds like a father. Obviously, to some extent, she will look like a father. But when it comes to actually having a foundation, ironically, to say this is what I did, some might say, well, she was kicked out of UNC. That's not necessarily the point. I would argue that David Abdullah, political leader of the MSJ, at the very least, he could say, well, these are the issues that I have constantly harped on for the last 10 years. And he has ultimately a track record as a union leader before entering into politics. The thing is, at the end of the day, Michaela Pandey's candidacy is an opportunity lost. But the person who, ironically, may lose the most out of the opportunity that's lost might be Michaela Pandey herself. Now the question is, to what extent will the country lose if she herself is unsuccessful? Or, worse off, what track record do we have? Because at least with the other main political parties, we could say this is what they did or they're doing. From the TPP to the NTA to the UNC to the PNM. There is some sort of public track record, whether in government as a politician or working within the system in whatever other capacity. And it makes me wonder to some extent, again, if the goal of governing and dealing with issues and offering leadership, guidance, and support was lost on this one candidate because she was too busy being concerned about the politicking. But it's not just new candidates, political leaders of new parties offering themselves up. There was this situation in Moruga Secondary where a teacher had to intervene. Now, that in and of itself, that's a whole issue that begs the question exactly what teachers are supposed to do in this situation. Because tutor on one hand is reported warning teachers about intervening in fights while praising the teacher for putting themselves essentially in the way of the blows, because a few students, mostly female and reportedly at least one male, were attacking a single female student. And this teacher attempted to intervene, to put himself in between. He had a broom, he tried to fend off the assailants. And it begs the question, as a society, what do we want from our teachers in this situation? Because if you take away all context, a set of people are ganging up to hit a woman. One would argue that outside of the context of school and teachers and ages, anybody coming to intervene would normally have a right to swing back in order to try to get the assailants to back off. Now, they don't necessarily have to. They could attempt a human shield, but that's a very good way to risk your own life without actually saving the person involved, depending. So again, if it's a set of people in the street, 3 women and a man attacking a single woman and another man comes to intervene, one would argue, yeah, it makes sense, he could swing back. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about a teacher and students. Is it okay for a teacher to swing back? Because then, and this is where in the past, human society might have been fine allowing it to be flexible, open-ended, and you take it on a case-by-case basis. And maybe it's a feeling of how modern societies have progressed, where we now need to have everything written down in plain English and hard lines drawn. Because if a teacher now lays his hands on a student, that sets a precedent that can be exploited, even if what's done in a specific incident is done in good faith and in all bounds of ethical morality. It can be used to exploit a situation further down the road. One of tutor's concerns, what if the teacher gets allegations of misappropriate touching if he doesn't look to swing, but he attempts to pull the students away? And it doesn't just have to be limited to the female students. Male teacher, male student could still get allegations in 2025 of inappropriate touching. I mean, we're not North America or Canada, so I don't expect it to necessarily go to the extreme silly season with regards to allegations like that. Doesn't mean that it can't go, not necessarily to the extent, but in that general direction. And tutors' right to have these concerns. I have to admit, I agree with them in this case. It is not that tutors' right so that teachers should not be involved at all. Because think about that implication. A student is being beaten by multiple students. But because of legal concerns, teachers can't intervene physically. Then, to some extent, the erosion of school discipline will more or less be complete because students essentially will be running the show. The inmates will be ruling the asylum. So, it's a tricky situation. And as a society, we kind of need to determine how we want to deal with it, because to say that there is a right answer, I think, would be misleading. Rather, there's subjectivity. And again, modern society wants to draw a hard line. So where we want to draw the hard line, we just need to determine, and we stick with that. The problem is the systems, the traditional systems of school discipline cannot keep up with the challenges now. The challenges now, to some extent, are born not because of necessarily failures with the school system. Although the school system is not perfect, I am not excusing it for its own failures. But to some extent, the failures of the school system didn't birth this problem. It opened a window by a nudge, and it allowed failures of society to peek through and to take root within the schools. And now we get to where we get. That's what I believe. How do we solve it? Again, it's complicated. Like I said, when one media house asked for comment by various politicians who have a linkage to education, of course the Minister of Education, as well as the UNC's candidates for Moruga, where the school I believe is located, who is also a former teacher, and the incumbent MP, none of them gave a comment in time for this article's publication. This is in today's Newsday. Although technically, to be fair to the minister, she did ask that the questions be given to her in a text message, but she did not respond. Now, to be fair to the minister, and to some extent to be fair to all politicians, this is one of those things where I think they don't want to lock in their colleagues into committing into a course of action. Although, one could argue, they all should have some capacity to speak on the issue in a neutral enough way, but in a way that will at least indicate that we are monitoring the issue, that we are attempting to seek redress, and what temporary measures would be put in place to ensure that potentially this does not further escalate or spread elsewhere. And in the case of the opposition, what their intentions would be to try to deal with these situations. Maybe as an MP, what she would do for her constituency, etc., etc. And I get it. Usually, we're a democratic country, but our politics is technically run in a top-down model that might be more communist than democratic. As much as the various political leaders will be upset if you challenge them with that statement. That is the perceived reality by enough of us from the outside looking in, that I think it's reasonable to state that at least to some degree, our politics are centrally planned. That's why the various members of a party, no matter who they are on the slate, they tend to have issues speaking independently, because what we see multiple consequences of how that could go wrong, from maybe an MP voicing an opinion that cabinet goes against at the end of the day, or the political leader of the opposition or senior opposition members goes against at the end of the day, to a senior minister making decisions as acting prime minister, and then essentially having to take a slap on your wrist, and no one is wanting to call it a slap on your wrist. And at the end of the day, I think this is a blind spot and a failing of our political process. Going back to my first point, because we are too concerned about the politicking and not necessarily concerned about governing, or even responsible, accurate, and dare I say reasonable messaging. There is a clip of Stuart Young with regards to Venezuela and the opposition leader calling President Maduro a narco-trafficker. I'm going to hold off on that clip for now, depending on, it was connected to the clip that I showed yesterday. It's even more, well, dare I say, bacchanalish. Or it could come across as though I am attacking the Prime Minister. That's part of the reason why I want to hold off on it. I don't want to do it for the sake of being aggressive. Only if the point continues to be valid, I think I'll show it. It's just one of those things where I don't want to be politicking for or against anybody. But it shows limitations in communication. It shows that the priority in the moment was more about politicking, the opposition this, the opposition that, than governing. And Stuart Young is not the only one guilty of this. The opposition is guilty of this. And to some extent, you could see the hints from other prospective politicians, and I pointed out the example of Michaela Pandey, who would be guilty of this. Will Gary Griffith be guilty of it? He hasn't necessarily shown enough to say that I could label him potentially doing that. But unfortunately, we see all too often politicians end up conforming to the stereotypes that we don't like, and yet somehow we don't like these things, but they feel compelled to conform to those stereotypes. What does that say about us? But more importantly, again, back to the point. Why does it seem as though we do not have candidates that have real capacity and agency to represent their constituencies? Because, don't forget, the opposition says it, the UNC says it. They don't have the opinion of their constituents. They have the opinion of the party. They follow the party line. They say it blatantly. The PNM at least doesn't say it as blatantly, but the flip side to that is, to some extent, they don't want to admit it. So you could argue that's better or worse. Take your pick. We don't have candidates who have agency to determine their responsibilities, to offer up their opinion, to try to seek performance, and dare I say greatness, because it's more important to our centrally planned system of politics that they conform. So then now, and I've said this before, our education system, our job employment system, it is geared to conformity. We are taught how to conform, pass an exam by memorization and rote. We go up the ladder. Maybe if we have good university lecturers, they will teach us the right way on how to critically think and how to problem solve. But then when you get into your first entry-level job, you are told to only do what you're told. You're not paid to think, and you're not paid to speak. And people like that start off getting the first set of promotions, up the ladder, until eventually what do you have? You have to pick leaders out of followers. Because the actual people with leadership qualities, the independent thinkers, those with their own opinion, those that have something of value to be brought to the table, more often than not, they are suppressed because when they start off, they're not paid to think. And that's how we end up with a commissioner of police that seemingly does not know what she's doing, with people, political appointees on boards that have no ability to deal with crisis management. We have politicians where we have to argue how many of them are ready, because it's not just the prime minister who leads, it's all of the ministers. How many of them are ready to be leaders? A couple are. A couple understand how to navigate the system and play the game. But then, in the course of doing so, how many of those are caught by the game, by the system, and all good intentions eventually gets washed away as they are too concerned about having to, again, politic as opposed to govern or lead. So now, as we are 3 weeks away from the next election, dare I ask, because political analyst Derek Ramsey made the point, what is the track record of Michaela Pandey? But I want to ask, to what extent could we attribute the track record of political parties to all of its candidates, some of whom were recently fresh selected and have no, certain candidates to replace outgoing ones in the PNM? What's their track record? Same thing with regards to the UNC. And when you're following the party line, do you have a track record to say you're a candidate? But at the end of the day, I guess to our society, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that we are not asking for greatness from our politicians, because we don't vote for politicians, we vote for a symbol. That's why all of the campaign slogans will invariably lead to put your X by the Balize or put your X by the rising sun. Not put your X for your candidate because you believe in your candidate. So then now, we're left to wonder, oh my gosh, there are no good leaders. I can't vote for any of them. PNM, Young, UNC, Passad Bissessa, I don't like either. There's no one for me to vote for. Who is going to replace Kamla? Who would replace Rowley? There's nobody. Nobody I like. Why? I mean, to some extent, Stuart Young is one of the closest we've come to someone who at least has been putting in individual effort that we could see. Is it good enough? The jury has yet to determine that, the jury being the voting population. Assuming no shenanigans, I don't expect there to be, but I'm just throwing that disclaimer out there. The opposition leader has lost 2 elections. What does she have to her name? But more importantly, she's going to have to retire sooner rather than later, just out of age. Who replaces her? Who has a track record in the UNC to replace her? Who has a track record in the UNC that will give the voting public confidence? And this could be one of the things where how the UNC is operated, it might bite them in the rear end down the line. By holding on to the status quo, they are even potentially less prepared than the PNM to then move forward. Even if they win this election, they probably might be geared to lose the following one very easily because of that, depending on how they manage the next 5 years, whether they win or lose. But hey, it doesn't really matter to the vast majority of us, because candidates don't matter, leadership don't matter, performance, it really doesn't matter. It really doesn't. You know what matters? What matters is, I'm voting for the Balize, or I'm voting for the rising sun, or maybe I might fall out of line and vote for somebody else. Will I stick with that somebody else? Probably not. We don't actually debate the issues beyond what food I eat when my people was in power, and that's why I like them. Not what their country did for them, but what favors their politicians and what freeness their party gave to them. All right. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll get into, this is longer than I expected, but the point the point just presented itself to me. So we'll take a quick break. When we come back, we'll go into maybe one story daily review. A couple of big stories happened with regards, ironically, centered around corruption and national security. We'll probably only hit one of them this morning when we come back after this.
Do you need treatment for obesity or any related abdominal procedures? The community hospital now offers minimally invasive laparoscopic surgery done by an American-trained, board-certified surgeon with over 20 years' experience. Give us a call at 235-5479 for more information.
The Community Hospital of Seventh-day Adventist,
where good private health care is affordable.
This is Face of Sports, WESN Content Capital. How you felt about the kiss on the lip?
That's the business. I'm nothing to do with that.
I find that was a distasteful.
The national senior team, whether you like it or not, that is the model for all other teams to follow.
I'm assuming that the regional requirement may be a much stricter requirement.
This is not about Pro League and Super League. This is a league run by the Normalization Committee that I'm responsible for.
Nobody expected FIFA to fund this arrangement.
If we don't get a professional attitude towards this, we are doomed for failure.
You break the balance, trip the leg, control the body.
They ain't gonna stand put forever.
Why you want the Chiefs to lose so? Why you want the Chiefs to lose so?
They already have two. Lamar don't
Why?
have.
You're jealous because you know the Chiefs getting closer to the Patriots. Let's go to the last part.
No,
of this game.
no.
Let's go to the last part.
I'm back here and talking about the essential. Michael Small here. Don't have much time, so we'll just hit one story, and that is, at least in one daily newspaper, the front page story of the morning, the charges against MP, or I guess technically former MP, because Parliament has been dissolved, David Lee, has been dropped. Now, I won't necessarily go into all of the framing and the politicking around this situation, right? Don't have the time for that. You know, what Mr. Lee said, thanking his political leader and all of that. But I will, however, go to the allegations that this is a political witch hunt. The irony of the situation is we do have to wonder, right? Apparently, one of the daily newspapers, and I think only one, I did try to read the stories from all three in this case, did state that the Director of Public Prosecutions, his immediate response, this is how the report phrased it, was to apply for a judge's warrant for the two. This is MP David Lee and his co-accused defendant Hugh Leong Poi. So the DPP believes that there's enough evidence to take the matter before a judge, and then the judge could issue a warrant, also call a bench warrant, to re-arrest the two on the charges and face the High Court directly, because the Chief Magistrate is the one that upheld a no-case submission by David Lee's attorneys. Ironically, we do have to wonder to what extent is the UNC now prepared to say that the DPP, You know, the same DPP that went against the government, that said, no, I don't want to go into the building that you decided my office needs to go in without dealing with the security concerns for my office that I have as an independent office holder who deals with criminal prosecution cases and thus have serious security concerns. That DPP, the DPP who has complained and who other third parties has complained on behalf of him, whether solicited or not, the fact that his office is understaffed, undermanned, under-resourced, under-financed, and thus one could argue, as has been argued on Talking Point by our very own Karen Shishera, that the government is attempting to softly push the DPP, not directly, but indirectly through under-resourcing his office, make him incapable of fully carrying out his job, and hopefully push him out of the door because they can't fire him directly. That is a lot of the public framing and consensus and perception of the situation. That doesn't necessarily mean it's true. But I have a hard time thinking, because apparently this is a political witch hunt. The problem is the DPP is acting. So how is it that the DPP is a government, bloodhound, while also being outside of the good graces of the government and being in various situations where he has come into conflict with the government? That whole building, you rent for it, that's gone. And there's no version of events that the government looks good with the money lost for renting that building on Park Street. For no apparent value. So this is one of those things where I do wonder again, are you really, and this actually goes into my criticisms of Stuart Young yesterday, including the video that I haven't shown yet. Are you thinking, before you speak, are you thinking about putting all of your ducks in a row before you mention what it is you're mentioning? Because the opposition saying, well, this is a political witch hunt, is basically trying to say the DPP is in their pocket. But that doesn't fall in line with the entire narrative of Roger Gaspard and his contentious relationship with Cabinet. Now, the other thing about the situation that David Lee has found himself in is that David Lee, we do have to question, I do think there's an argument to be made that technically no laws are broken. Technically. Right? Just kind of based on what I understand of the case, essentially, the DPP, I believe, wants to make a case that a luxury car was bought for a third party through MP David Lee and the tax exemptions he is entitled to as an MP for his personal vehicle, which would be against the law. The reason why I say technically no laws were broken is technically it might have been done in a way where no actual law was broken, except the spirit of the law may have been broken, right? Now, because if it's a one-off, it might be very difficult to prove that David Lee went against the law. If it was that the MP had a commercial operation where he was bringing in vehicles for a set of people, or even just doing favors for friends, but the point is there's a pattern of behavior, there might be a stronger case. So now we need to ask ourselves, to what extent do we want this situation to be prosecuted? And then also, to what extent will we be upset if it's found out that, like I said, technically, MP David Lee didn't break any laws. Now, the potential taxes that were lost in this situation is over $1 million, right? Between customs, VAT, and one other tax that I can't remember, and motor vehicle tax. Almost $300 in VAT, almost $300,000 in VAT, almost $300,000 in motor vehicle tax, and $800,000+ in customs duty. So we're looking at like 1.4 million, something along those lines. To some extent, it sounds like a lot of money, but with regards to national budget, it's not that much money, right? To what extent, ironically, do we as a society want this case to be aggressively pursued? But here's the other issue. Now, the PNM has rightfully said, well, that's the DPP, you need to direct your questions to the DPP. The idea is, I would argue that if we want to say that all politicians are corrupt, well, then the government would have a stake for this case not to move forward. Because again, it will set a precedent that will then restrict their capacity to do the same. And usually, the cynical side of my brain says politicians don't want doors and windows to be closed. They want the cracks to stay open so that they could always exploit the loopholes. This might, depending on how you perceive it, be a way to get around the law. It might be a loophole. It might be something that the law doesn't adequately cover depending on if the DPP is successful or not, right? If the DPP is not successful, then I think it's reasonable to say the law might not cover the specific incidents of how it was done enough to give an affirmative pronouncement on the case. It's expected that the government is basically going to say, one political analyst said, well, he is not guilty, but he hasn't been necessarily been declared as innocent either. This is to say David Lee. But again, how do we want to treat with it? Do we want to see the loopholes closed? Will the politicians look to close the loopholes? It's interesting to see where the government moves forward. And dare I say, there's a part of me that thinks the fact that they're willing to campaign on this issue, I do actually think there's some merit in it. It's just that I also have expectations that they will decry David Lee for doing what he did, whether it is considered illegal or not at the end of the day, but then potentially do it and conveniently forget about this entire series of messaging in the future. Because that is the consistency of political communication, at least by the major parties. And that's one of the things that's frustrating me excessively right now, because the population, and to some extent the media, is allowing politicians to get away with it. Because to some extent, I think neither side has a consistent record to speak about corruption for me to take them seriously about it. Neither side. And notice, not one campaign promise has been made about cleaning up corruption. Or they talk about individual cases that the other side has done. But no one actually is putting together any proposal to say, all right, this happened, you know what? Let's not try to go after the people that did X, Y, and Z. Let's try to put laws in place to ensure that it doesn't happen again. We don't hear nothing about that. Not one word. Why? Because again, history has shown me at least, I wouldn't say us, but me, that politicians don't want to close loopholes. And then I will assume it's because they may want to exploit them in the future. Or they may have colleagues already exploiting them. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll welcome our media ambassador. Stay tuned.
My name is Dr. Stephen Carroll, the CEO at Community Hospital of Seventh-day Adventist, and we are committed to making good private health care affordable.
For all your medical needs, including dental, radiology, laparoscopy, behavioral and mental health, along with many other services, contact us for more information at 235-5479.
Community Hospital of Seventh-day Adventist,
where good private health care is affordable.
This is 10 Questions. I'm Andy Johnson. The distance from where we should be in the world in going forward on our commitments with climate change.
The effects of climate change that cannot be accounted for. It's called loss and damage, and we're seeing loss and damage happening so much more in this decade and the previous decade.
The principal term there was this question of the correspondent banking issues.
That is why we're trying to build capacity with this country here, Trinidad and Tobago, and other countries in the region. Man is not showing any signs of stopping or even slowing down. More than half of the forest in Trinidad is already gone.
All the plants and all the animals and all of the nice clean water and fresh air and everything had to be on this planet for humanity to have a chance.
We have small change when it comes to countries that can take decisions, and when they speak, the world listens.
The General Assembly is a very democratic forum. And Trinidad and Tobago has the same vote as Canada, in spite of the obvious difference in size.
As always, we appreciate you starting your day with us. Let's get into this morning's first conversation. Is the country's healthcare system more at risk, more than ever? Why it has remained unaddressed for so long?
Political parties get lots of cash, big cash from financiers, and then when they get that now, you can't account for it.
But it's really the specialist nurses who we are in a greater shortfall for.
We can tap into the resources and have them, at least form some mentorship programs.
Highlight our food systems, and which will attract persons from all over the world to come and experience something that actually supports the local economy.
We're lucky that we have a vibrant legal system that allows change to take place, and it's not that matters are just swept under the carpet and discrimination is allowed to be perpetrated.
A lot of people don't know that there were attempts to ban the carnival, suppress the carnival.
Our award-winning show is back, and this season promises to be even more exciting than before. What's Up, Doc isn't just a title, it's a call to action for anyone who wants to improve their health and well-being. Join us on this thrilling ride towards better health on WESN Content Capital.
Pastor J, I want to get a tattoo.
You really
respond
wanna
to me. Respond to me how you would respond to me.
The first question I'll ask is why.
Controversial taboo topics.
We get so consumed by church, we forget that we have to live the life of being a Christian outside of the Sunday.
Like you say,
services.
we think going to a service makes us a Christian.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right. So here we are about to hear the second time Pastor J wanted to take a tattoo.
Would have been late last year and early this year.
Oh gosh.
Hope Unfiltered podcast with Pastor J and Ren.
FanZone, your reliable, authentic supplier, has just gotten better. You can now visit our website www.fanzonett.com for your authentic wear and collectibles. The only place where you can use both your Visa debit and credit cards. Visit our website fanzonett.com to make your purchase today.
This is Face of Sports, WESN Content Capital. How you felt about the kiss on the lip?
That's the business. I'm not to do with that.
And I find that was distasteful.
The national senior team, whether you like it or not, that is the model for all other teams to follow.
I'm assuming that the regional requirement may be a much stricter requirement.
This is not about Pro League and Super League. This is a league run by the Normalization Committee that I'm responsible for.
Nobody expected FIFA to fund this arrangement.
If we don't get a professional attitude towards this, we are doomed for failure.
You break the balance, trip the leg, control the body.
They ain't gonna stand put forever.
Why you want the Chiefs to lose so? Why you want the Chiefs to lose so?
They already have two. Lamar don't
Why?
have.
You're jealous because you know the Chiefs getting closer to the Patriots. Let's go to the last part.
No,
of the game.
no.
Let's go to the last part.
I'm back here on Talking About WSND Content Capital, and as you could see, I have attempted to wear one of my better combinations this morning because I knew that once again I will be challenged by the fashion sense, by the wardrobe choices of my guest this morning. We have, of course, Inspector Kirk Callender, who has outflanked me with his little burst of color. You know, subtle hints to say, hey, I'm still #1 on this show when it comes to men's fashion. Inspector Callender, good morning.
A blessed morning to you, Sean, and blessed morning to all of Trinidad and Tobago. And wherever they are tuned in or listening in the world today, it's always a pleasure to be back here. And I tried my best to dress down this morning. Because I told myself that you knew I was coming.
Yes,
so
I did, yes, this time.
You probably would have made some adjustment, but I see once again that
it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. Now, the inspector's not here just for his looks. He's also here to offer some important information. A continuation of last week's conversation, but one that seems far more pertinent now, I would argue, given the fact that we now have concrete incidences. And I did mention yesterday, we need to understand that these things could escalate, and at least the police in Tobago decided, hey, we need to have a conversation to try to head this off at the pass. So from what you know, what are the concerns of the police service on a whole? Because just because, you know, the incident that happened on record happened in Tobago doesn't mean that it has to be limited to Tobago.
Well, there were also incidents of vandalism in other constituencies. Primarily, one of those constituencies was the Lauket at Alparo, where, you know, certain billboards were torn down and stuff like that, which is tantamount to malicious damage. And as I would have mentioned the last time I was here, every election we have similar incidents. And I also would have mentioned that it has not escalated to anything greater that would cause the police to have any grave concerns in relation to these infractions. That being said, we are not treating it, I am not saying that the TTPS is treating it lightly or intends to treat it lightly. And we want to treat with things from both a common sense approach as well as from the law's perspective as well. So we are saying we want good sense to prevail, and in the event that that fails, well, then we would have to go to the letter of the law.
Sorry, what was that last part?
We would prefer good sense to prevail. So dialogue is key, but if good sense does not prevail, then we may be required to go to the letter of the law.
But I would argue that it's been harder for good sense to prevail just because of where you see it abroad as well.
Yes.
Lines are being drawn in the sand, and I believe last week you yourself did bring up the fact that, look, at least in certain parts of the country, people can have their political differences and come back together.
That's right.
But then I would argue that, to some extent, there would be, as much as that might exist, I don't necessarily think it's universal. And my fear is that that's going to be eroded if the general sentiment of how we engage in politics is a combative one. It's a us against them, right? And this is where the race part of politics, and to a lesser extent the Trinidad versus Tobago part of that dynamics with Tobago politics, it concerns me. But for the wider country, the race talk especially, but even if we eliminate the race talk, then it's a PNMUNC, right? And you see this similar in the States, where I would argue, and there's a question on the comment section that I think to some extent goes to this, where, and this case with David Lee, it brings up the question, you know, is arms of the state being used against politicians, right? In fact, the situation in India, one could argue it's the accusations are there. And when that happens, you know, all of a sudden, it's not always going to be limited to politicians and what they do. The followers take lead, and then they'll be more willing to have a confrontation, because I think it's something about you feel your side is morally right.
Right.
But then the unspoken part of that is you feel justified maybe breaking boundaries or pushing past limits that you shouldn't, because you think that ultimately right is on your side. So, you know what, I have to confront this person. And if violence has to happen, then violence has to happen, because how can I let this evil stand? And I guess now similar to the school fight incident where a teacher had to kind of stand in the middle, the police now find themselves potentially being caught in the middle when these things happen.
Well, unfortunately, every time there is an election, be it rightly or wrongly so, there are two things that raises its ugly head. One is the race, and the other one is the certain color against another color. We both know what those two colors are.
Yeah.
Right? But for us in the TTPS, we cannot be swayed or lose track of what John Public is saying. We have to be guided by the laws of Trinidad and Tobago, and we have to allow good sense to prevail and enforce the law. But more importantly, to adopt a proactive approach whereby to meet with all the representatives and their management team to remind them, to remind their supporters and their followers to be guided by the laws of Trinidad and Tobago, because it may not necessarily, and I'm not saying the representative and the management team is responsible for what their supporters are doing, but they have an influence. They can have some level of positive influence over their supporters to let them know in no uncertain terms, we are not going to stand for this. We are not going to stand for anybody breaking the law, because we are law-abiding citizens and we want you, our followers and our supporters, to follow suit. They have that level of influence over their supporters.
I mean, that's one of the things I think, because when you listen to some of the political language, I would argue that because it's so absolutist, right? At the end of the day, if you call the other side evil and wicked, well, at some point, you slay the evil dragon. I think David Lee, even in one of the articles with regards that came out after the chief magistrate upheld the submission to throw out his case, he mentioned, I can't remember the context that he mentioned the dragon, but the point is, you slay the dragon. You don't negotiate with the dragon.
Right.
You don't compromise with the dragon. You slay the dragon, and you slay the dragon how? You don't slay the dragon with rainbows and flowers and bunnies and unicorns. You take sword and fire and arrows and violence. And the more that, and to some extent, it's one of those weird things where humans like, rhetorical language, right? So we'll slay the evil that is the other side. And it's supposed to be, we will slay them because we will be better than them, we will defeat them in the polls, we will outperform them as government. But at some point, the public, and this is funny that I say this, because I am not a proponent of violent video games and movies causes young people to violence. I think that's a very, very unproven and dare I say, almost borderline, it overestimates the influence. But politicians who are speaking about real life and speaking about your real life and what you're going through and what you need to do in order to make your life better, that's different than playing a video game where you see some warped version of reality.
Well, what I can tell you is this, someone holding or standing behind a microphone is a very powerful individual. And do not believe for 1 second that what you see or what you may imply, be it directly or indirectly, does not have an impact or an influence on persons who are listening, be it directly or indirectly, especially if you use certain tones and particular languages. So whether it was suggested or implied, the persons listening, your supporters listening, they may, based on what you said, they may take it in a completely different context. And be it rightly or wrongly, so you may say, well, I didn't mean that. I never said that. I mean, that is to be debated. But to the supporters and to the followers, it's almost as if you are pushing them in a particular direction to behave a particular way. You understand? And that is where the line gets blurry now.
I would argue that politicians, especially if you see somebody on a platform speaking for 45 minutes to an hour, they're not going to remember everything they said. No. And I've already seen situations where, to some extent, they contradict themselves. So I could very much see where to them, it's just a thing they say. But to the listener, and I said yesterday, you have to be careful how the listener doesn't interpret it how you want it to be interpreted.
Correct.
But to some extent, is there any concern also? Because it's one thing to say politicians, but there's also the media who technically convey the words of the politicians. Now, the media is I guess, at times could be in a more ethical dilemma, because if you don't report what is said, then you're editing what they're saying, you know, in a manner that they don't approve of, which can be wrong. But the flip side is, if you just give out what they say verbatim, to some extent that might not always be the best thing. Is there any concern that the media has a part to play in order to try to help?
The media has a huge part and a huge role to play in relation to ensuring that the candidates toe the line, for want of a better word, or function and operate within the parameters not only of the law, but of, you know, to ethics, where ethics and morality, well, a certain politician did say that politics have a morality of its own, but that is a conversation for another time.
I would argue that he didn't mean for the morality of its own to be played out publicly, right? I'll just, to be fair to him, although it's not really a good statement anyway, but yeah.
Yeah, so the media has a huge role to play. I mean, hence the reason I would have seen many ads in the media.
Yes.
And at the end of it, they said this...
it's a paid political broadcast.
It is a paid political broadcast.
It actually, at one point, I think, sometime before the news or after the news, there were back-to-back ads. So you had, this is a paid political broadcast ad, that was a paid political broadcast, this is and then like you had back-to-back ads. So there was more disclaimer on the air than actual political messaging.
Yes, but the media has a person in the media very powerful, because there are persons out there listening to you. You know?
Yeah.
There are persons out there, I mean, even a blogger, they have tremendous influence over a person because there are people that follow them. I mean, I don't want to stray too much, but the terrorists, for example, you no longer have to go to wherever it is to be radicalized, and you could be you can be radicalized right in front of your desktop and your laptop at home. So it's similar if you look at the influence that politicians have over their followers.
Now, but I would argue that the rhetoric with regards to comments at times could be even worse, much worse than what politicians say on a microphone. So for the interests of citizens, to what extent, based on your knowledge, yes, it's not always easy to prove, but people should not think just because it's on the internet, they're not responsible for potential consequences of their statements if it can be reasonably traced back to them, depending, right? If it meets a certain burden of proof, can they be held liable for what they say, especially if it leads to something bad happening?
And that is the thing, that is a part of the law, which has so many gray areas that has never been tested. You understand? And I don't want to go down the road of how efficient or inefficient of a criminal justice system is. Nobody never tested it.
I'll just say that's one of those areas where our legislation is falling behind.
Yes.
And if you have to leave it to a judge, it's a crapshoot. That's not a knock on the judicial system, because they would then have to try to make chicken salad out of you know what. If the law doesn't directly address it, it's not an optimal situation.
Now, what you would have seen in the past, and is still seeing in this election campaign, is depending on what you say about who, you could be sued.
Right.
Pre-action protocol letters, and that kind of thing. So that is really the civil side of it. But the criminal side of it is a lot of gray areas, and to meet the threshold would be quite challenging.
Right. But not impossible. If it gets too extreme, it's not impossible.
Well, yes, I mean, we still do have treason on the books. We still have what you call sedition and all these kind of things. And many people are even calling for that to be removed from the law books because it's a draconian law and all that.
I mean, I was thinking about literally if someone goes so far as to say, basically call for violence and make threats.
Well, yeah,
directed statements of violence.
There are laws for that, actually. But, I mean, it has to be direct. As opposed to using certain undertones.
I do feel as though the direction we're headed, it's not impossible, Because people will have this, you know, thought that the internet is like this international area outside of TNT's jurisdiction, when the reality is it's not a physical location, so you can't think of it like that.
Right.
It's not this off-limits place to the law. You know, it just depends on to what extent a crime can be proven to have been happened.
Right.
And if it goes too far, and I do think we see the language maybe getting more and more incendiary. So then the comment section gets more and more, listen, some of it...
Heated, very heated.
Heated is an understatement. Some of it is outright racist. I'll just say that there, right? Yeah. And that's the stuff that I can remember, and that might be underselling it and putting it lightly, right? So that's why I won't put it past, all it takes is one.
True.
Now to something more specific, because you mentioned if you say destroy someone's property that has a billboard, obviously that billboard is not a poster on a street, on a signpost, right? But for things like that, where someone is potentially putting up flyers in public spaces, for lack of a better word, right? Is it against the law for somebody else then to tear it down? Because one could argue it shouldn't be there in the first place.
But when you said flyer, be a little more specific. You're talking about these paper stuff that you just stick up.
Yeah, that you just stick up on a like a light post.
I mean, the light post is not public property, actually. Yeah? It actually belongs to TNTT.
Right,
actually,
okay.
Actually, you are even supposed to get permission from the respective service providers to use the lamppost for that. Eh?
So obviously a political party might, although that's a whole other ethical debate there, right? Well, let's assume supporters, they make their own flyer, they put it up. I don't support that party. Not that I've done this, it's an example. But I'm like saying, you're not supposed to put it up there, you don't have permission. Let's just say I know they don't have permission, I tear it down. Is that against the law?
If you're stretching it, yes. I mean, if you really going to have to go to the letter of the law, because it is something that has value.
Right.
And it costs money to design the flyer, to print it, and time and effort to stick it. You understand? It's
one of those things where it's subjective enough that it's not guaranteed that I would get off if it goes to court.
Well, further to that, right? There are other things, there are other factors that has to be taken into consideration. Was anybody unduly affected by that? How much time is it going to cost the court?
Right. I would argue
to pursue a matter like that.
I would argue that to some extent you're implying that then TNTT supports party X because you're putting it on TNTT's property. The flip side is if I put my own poster now we have like a two falls kind of situation where whose rights, who has precedence. And maybe this is why people just shouldn't do the wrong thing from the start.
TNTT might say, well, we didn't give anybody permission to use the pole.
All right, so there's another part to this, but we have Digger Martin on the line, so we'll take the call first. Digger Martin, good morning, caller. You're on the air. Sorry for the wait.
No, it's okay. Good morning, Mr. Small, and good morning, it's Inspector Calendar.
Yes.
Good morning to you, sir.
Morning to you.
I have some very pointed questions on the TTPS. First of all, I'm glad you are giving us citizens information about how people have to behave. And whilst you are giving me information on how to behave during the election, I'm hoping that you are looking at yourself with respect for behavior that shows that you all are not politically biased. And I'm drawing from history, the Sadibat issue and the voter pardon issue, where the police service has been caught wanting for those issues. We have a case that has not apparently been dropped with a particular MP. You had a former commissioner of police said he doesn't receive no instructions from the political hierarchy. You only take advice. I want to know if you all were given instruction or advice not to investigate another attorney general who had an issue with transferring cars. That is one issue. I want to hear how you all are approaching that. The other issue is the behavior of police with respect to a number of things. It happened an appeal going on where a CEO of a company was beheaded and a policeman was incarcerated for that. That person who was beheaded, it is alleged that he was the nephew of a PNM minister. Now, the question is, that policeman has been incarcerated for a long while. And Attorney General said in Parliament that it costs us $25,000 to upkeep a prisoner. So we have been spending money to keep that particular policeman. I want to know how the police service has addressed that particular policeman. Is he still being paid half of his salary? Has he been terminated because the Commissioner of Police has been given the mandate to discipline people out of the police service for miscreant behavior? He has already been prosecuted. He is on appeal. I want to know how the police service is addressing those issues, because I feel it from my pocket. The fact that I had to maintain a prisoner for $25,000 and that policeman might still be engaged, getting half pay within the police service. I'll go on and have a nice morning.
Thank you, caller.
Right, so you raised a lot of points there. I want to tackle the last one first, though. A police officer that is incarcerated, like any other person that is incarcerated, it is an allegation that was made against him that the state has to prove. He who alleges has to prove. So that police officer that is sitting there in prison is innocent until proven guilty, as everybody else that is incarcerated.
Yes.
And to answer his question, yes, the police officer is being paid because he is sitting in prison awaiting his day in court to prove his, well, not to prove his innocence, for the state to determine his guilt or innocence. Right? I did not charge myself. I did not allege that I did anything. The state did. And should I suffer twice on the presumption of innocence? So the caller, to answer the caller, yes, the police officer has been paid. As a matter of fact, anybody that is being charged, whether it's police, soldier, air guard, coast guard, or any member of the Ministry of National Security, that person is still being paid until Service Commission writes them and indicates to them that to give them a reason within 2 weeks why they should not be dismissed. And that is only when they are found guilty and the court exhausted all their appeals and now sentenced to a term of imprisonment.
Yeah, I think this situation, it's not that the system is wrong. We need to understand that. The issue is that the trial takes too long.
Too long. I mean,
right?
a murder case taking about 10 to 15 years before it even reach the high court.
Right. So the problem is, because if the thing was operating properly, then this is fine, right? So I'm not quick to say, oh, well, we need to change this because it's not right. Well, what if he's innocent at the end of it, right? The law is the law and the standard is the standard, and I've said this before. It's not that I am defending criminals. Innocent until proven guilty is a thing, because if you get falsely accused, you don't want to be guilty unless you prove you're innocent to be the new standard, right?
But not only that, you also don't want to be fired and there is no salary coming in to take care of your family while you are in prison, knowing that you're innocent.
So that's the thing. What will happen is, let's just say he's fired against procedure. And again, this procedure would assume that the criminal justice system and the judiciary is moving at a reasonable pace. Then if he's found innocent at the end, he could sue the state.
Correct.
Not just for his salary, but also for damages.
That's right.
Right? And I've already mentioned yesterday another situation. Look, money goes out the door by hundreds of thousands of dollars all the time. So this is one of those things where the problem is not him collecting the money. The problem is it's taking so long that, yes, he's essentially on a free ride, but it's not by choice. It's because the state's inefficiencies are essentially exposing certain problems, some of which cannot necessarily be solved by direct action by the state, from what I understand. Look, it's just One issue leads to another issue, leads to another issue, leads to another issue, right? And in this case, with regards to this aspect of the criminal justice system, I would argue it's not the fault of the police, because if the police was able to have a 100% detection rate on every crime, then wait times might double might be an understatement.
It wouldn't have much room in the prison, actually.
And with regards to the David Lee thing, that's the DPP. That's not yours.
Once, because we would have done our job. So the DPP, as some people may not know, has the power and the authority to initiate criminal proceedings against anyone, of course with the proper file and evidence and so on, and also to discontinue criminal proceedings against anyone. That is the power the office of the DPP have.
And with regards to the other situation that he mentioned with a former AG, to some extent, what we need to understand is the DPP, at times when it seems as though the case goes nowhere, it could be because the DPP said, look, there's not enough here, stop wasting your time. It's not whether the person is innocent or guilty, but rather the evidence that's available.
Because remember, the
to
DPP,
pursue the matter further.
The DPP represents the state, right? He's acting for and on behalf of the state. And as the DPP, which is like the guardian of democracy, do we have sufficient evidence that we can secure a conviction? Right?
Yeah.
So he has to look at all those other circumstances. And when I say he is the officer, because it have assistant DPP as well, so it's not one position we are speaking about. The office of the DPP has to take into consideration all those factors and arrive at the conclusion, do we have a strong case? Do we have sufficient evidence? A case in the High Court is lots of money. Remember, the state is paying to pursue this matter. Eh? So does it make sense to continue using the state's resources to pursue this matter or these matters when a conviction is guaranteed? In other words, the case is weak.
But also, with regards to David Lee's matter, so I do think the DPP, the police investigated, there was enough suspicion there to assume, hey, something wrong happened. The DPP went forward with it. Whatever other influence happened at the end of the day, again, you need to tell me that the DPP has political motivations, because right now I'll laugh at that, right? Given the fact that it seems as though both sides apparently, when it's convenient, will like to attack him. So with that said, whenever he goes after a politician, the whole talk about political persecution will come up, ironically, right? And we assume that it's leveled to the other side. But it's not just the other side, it's also to the DPP who gets leveled that argument. And depending, now let's go with the actual court matter. If a DPP, let's just say he overreaches, right? And that could be proven. To some extent, the state could be liable for malicious prosecution or things like that, right?
The appeal court, you have the appeal court for the office of the Privy Council.
But my point is, more lawsuits could happen if you just willy-nilly level aggressive accusations and take things too far, and you don't have the evidence to support it, which is why the DPP is saying, hey, there's not enough evidence to support it. It's not just about the court fees and the time, which is bad enough because the courts are backed up. But there's also the fact that if things get too bad, malicious prosecution charges, amongst others, could be levied, and then it costs more for the states.
It costs more for the state. Yeah, because that and that is a good point you would have raised there. I mean, there are so many matters that are settled out of court when someone sues the state, and because the Attorney General realized it doesn't really make sense to pursue this matter. The state just concede, and they say, well, look, we concede that the state was wrong or erroneous in this matter. We would pay the damages.
So I have some questions from social media, but before I get to that, there's one other aspect to the topic that you brought to us that I need to get to you. And a Patriotic Front leader, she made accusations at different party supporters or party members or whatever. Others were what's the word? Intimidating her candidates. This happened on Friday, right? And there's, I guess this is not necessarily new that allegations like this has happened. Not to say that it's widespread and there's fighting on the street whenever it's nomination day. But to some extent, does this add to the concerns? Because we've had examples of intimidation when it comes to not just nomination day, but also election day as well? And is this something that the police might be looking to monitor?
Well, on the election day itself, you have the Representation of the People Act, right? That speaks about canvassing within a certain distance of every polling station, not wearing certain colors, and influencing persons to vote for any political party and stuff like that. So on the election day itself, the Representation of the People Act takes care of that. The police is guided by canvassing
I know, but there was also, at least in one year, I remember, people were saying allegations that certain groups were potentially, you know, intimidating,
well, and every
to kind of stay away voters of the other party that they were supporting.
Every election, we get these allegations, and every election we have to treat with it. I would love to know or hear a little more from that person that you spoke about. What her definition of intimidation is.
Right.
Because intimidation is relative, and it's also subjective. So intimidation in what way? So if I could get some more information on that, and of course, even if she believes so, he or any person believes so, once a report is made to the police, we are going to investigate it as best as we possibly can with the necessary resources. But these are things that comes up every election. It is nothing new to the police. And we would continue to treat with it as best as we possibly can in accordance with the law.
I mean, I understand what you're saying.
We are not here to pick any sides.
Because there is the human phenomenon that it's almost like if you have the expectation of persecution and intimidation, you will perceive things that are not necessarily persecution or intimidation to be that. But let's just say someone suspects this is happening on election day, they should call the police as soon as possible.
Well, the police is there. The police is already in every polling. Once there is a polling station, there are police officers assigned to every polling station. And persons of all parties and their supporters are being told in no uncertain terms what the law says. As a matter of fact, it have a distance in which, because they might set up their tents certain places around the polling station. Once it is not within the certain distance of the polling station that they could do their canvassing and so on, it's fine. But they still cannot, when they do vote for X, vote for Y, that is still canvassing, that is still against the law. You understand? So the police officers are there to constantly remind the persons of that. So, as a matter of fact, I would have known in many instances, persons were told to move their tents.
Right.
Because they were within the distance of the polling station. So they were told that the tent is too close to move the tent further away from the polling station.
Now, on a wider level, harassment, because again, one political leader saying other parties are harassing her candidates, and then potentially you could see where, and part of this, of everything that you came here to speak about, is not just party X is persecuted party Y. No. It could be the supporters who mean well, quote unquote, right? Not necessarily have good intentions, but they're so zealous in the support of their party that they cross the line with regards to the supporters of the party. The political leader, candidates, membership, chairman, none of them have to say a note because the members, the supporters, determine on their own to take it too far and maybe start to harass other people. The law, there are things to treat with that?
Well, yes, because we are speaking about a police officer has the power to arrest anyone who commits a breach of the peace in his presence, right? So let us say for all intents and purposes, the police was not wrong. There are other offenses that can occur under the Summary Offences Act and so many other acts, right? So you are quite correct. The supporters' action might not have anything to do with the candidate or and the management team and so on. It's just that they just take things a little too far because they realize, well, I am not aligned to your political views and I don't support your political candidate. So here what happening, you can't talk to me, don't pass here, no. And this is why last week, I would have reminded person what the Constitution says. You understand? So they have the right of the right of the individual to life, liberty, security of the person, and enjoyment of property. And the right not to be deprived thereof except by due process of law. The right of the individual to equality before the law and protection of the law. But there's one that speaks to who you want to support, who you choose to support. Right? So persons have to be reminded of that. They have to be mindful of that. That I could choose to support any political party that I choose. The right of the individual to express his private right. The right to join political parties and to express their political views. The right of a parent or guardian to provide a school. Well, of course, this is not politics. Freedom of conscience and religious belief, and freedom of thought and expression. Freedom of association and assembly, and freedom of the press. Well, of course, freedom of the press we were talking about that earlier. So I could choose today to go one political party's assembly. The next day I could choose to go another political party. That is my choice. Next week, another political party have a rally. I'm that too.
Right.
You understand? And next month, well, not next month, because election not finished. The other day, another political, I wear in every color. Today is this color, tomorrow is that color, the day after that is another color. That is my choice.
And I just want to say, because, of course, you know, around the world, not just in TNT, people don't want to talk religion and politics, right?
No.
Because it's a heavy thing.
Yes.
But obviously, to some extent, you can't always get away from either conversation. So to some extent,
you can.
Especially within your family, within your household, right? And this is one of the things that I want to ask you now. What warning would you want to give people so that they can understand, look, it's nice that you believe what you believe, whether religiously or politically, but especially now that we're in the election, 3 weeks from the election, people need to understand you can't try to force people to believe what you believe.
Exactly.
And don't cross certain lines. What do you want to say? Because we're talking about, it's personal relationships now, but I would assume the police services hope, and my hope and many others' hope would be, hey, let's not cross certain lines that we think is fine because we're family or we're friends, so we can, and then things get too far.
I think you would have said it best. So I want to remind the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago that we have a constitution, and the constitution is quite clear in relation to freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom to join political parties of their choice. We citizens of Trinidad and Tobago respect the rights of citizens. There are instances that are quite rightly mentioned. The household is totally divided, one supporting X party, another supporting Y party, and that is fine. Once they don't cross the lines and kill and chop and shoot anybody, they are entitled to, in the household, to support whatever political party that they choose. So be guided by the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago, and there are laws as it relates to the breach of the peace. There are laws that speaks to malicious damage of person's property, simply because you are not in agreement with the party or parties that they support. The police service would be out in full force, because we are out in every rally, every political meeting, regardless of which party is carrying on the political meeting. And we are there to maintain law and order, to ensure that there are no breaches of the peace occur. And once we are there, and we see persons breaking the law and there are breaches of the peace, we are going to arrest them. We have arrested, so far I have to say, apart from the minor infractions and so on, the police who have not been called upon to make any mass arrests or major arrests as it relates to persons encroaching on the constitutional rights and infringing on other person's rights. So far, the election campaign, from the TTPS's perspective, is going good as it relates to persons obeying the law in most instances. The rallies and the political, well, not the rallies, the political meeting had been incident-free at best thus far. So that is a good sign. Save and except outside of those things, which we had spoken about earlier, the tending and the signs and other than, and I'm not saying that we are downplaying these things. Don't get me wrong, Trinidad and Tobago, right? But from so far, the TTPS has, based on what has been reported and what I am seeing and reading, the political parties are conducting themselves within the confinements of the law at best in most instances, and I've seen that with the pinch as well. So we want to encourage the candidates, the management team, and their supporters to continue in that way.
And I'll just add one aspect that you see more in religion that I hope we don't eventually start to see here. I don't know to what extent it's practiced here. Shunning. So not everything has to be a confrontation. At least in religion, then it comes to, well, we shun you, so we have nothing to do with you anymore.
Right.
And that and all could be not against the law, but still a form of coercion or intimidation that could lead to an extreme response when you have a disagreement. Because again, I feel I have the moral high ground, so it's fine that the entire family shuns you, cuts you off, casts you out. And that sort of mindset, I think, is also, it's not, there's no violence. You know, the police can't be involved for that. There's no law that's broken. But now looking beyond that, it's just, again, to try to encourage people, don't take things too far, right? You could be within the law and still take things too far. And I'll leave that there. You know, the conversations with the media ambassadors will continue, of course, throughout the elections. If other things come up, we'll mention it. There's a couple of comments that I do want to get to from our social media on the show. The first asking me, with regards to our current political climate and the challenges facing the country, what style of leadership I believe is most effective for governance, and do I see that style reflected in our current government and political parties? I still would say generally the democratic style would be the best. It's not always the most efficient, right? But especially when we have a multicultural society, it's, you know, an autocratic leader. You know, so then who is the leader? So then it will be, then all of a sudden everything will be known to, well, which race is the leader, etc., etc. Where the leader come from, what area, that area again, too much goodies, all of that jazz, right? Yes, you could maybe have transactional styles. Yes, there's something, I actually would like to see more of that, where the various different corners of the country represented by the various parties compromise, make deals. Not everything is going to be perfect, and not everybody's going to have the perfect solution, because resources are finite, so you will never be able to treat with every problem, perfectly solve it across the board. And that's what makes the job difficult, but we don't necessarily see anything treating to that. One could argue there's too much autocratic in the veneer of democratic and too much laissez-faire leadership going on. And because of that, we have accountability problems in our society that does affect government, that does affect the criminal justice system, that does affect the political system, right? So a more democratic process, we're democratic, but do we really practice it? Not the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. Mm-hmm. The other comment is with regards to David Lee's case, and he was charged with fraud. The UNC labeled it politically motivated. The potential use of legal actions and tools for political intimidations in Trinidad and Tobago. Well, ironically, one of the extreme examples I showed yesterday, Inspector Calendar, I don't know if you know this, right? Mm-hmm. You know the whole hullabaloo about Jindal and the refinery? Mm-hmm. I don't know if you follow that. So apparently, well, okay, that was a whole thing. It caused me to look at his situation in India more closely. And apparently in India, the ruling party, they have a practice of basically saying, well, hey, opposition politician, if you cross the floor and join us, your case will go away. Right? And the opposition party has a term for it. It's called the washing machine, because it washes you. So we ain't even laundering money now. We laundering politicians, right? So have we seen anything to that extreme? No. Can it happen? Technically, yes, it can happen. I'll say this, currently right now, I have reason to believe that one, the DPP, and two, the rank and file of the police service, we could argue is independent. We already have allegations of a former assistant superintendent, or superintendent, I can't remember his rank, against a former commissioner of police with regards to his investigations into certain corruption cases and into certain politicians that apparently, to borrow again the phrase from former AG Reginald Moore, disappeared. So now the question is, you know, to what extent are we concerned that what is independent can be further compromised, or can be compromised, and thus further compromise the system? That's the better way to put it. I don't necessarily think that we are at the point where the criminal justice system could really be used directly and overtly as a tool to persecute political differences. There are more subtle things that are currently being done, right? But we're not there yet. But that's why when certain stakeholders talk about the independence of the DPP and the Auditor General, the independence of the police service, the independence of the Police Service Commission, the independence of the police force and the national security apparatus and the judiciary, that's why they matter. That's why, to some extent, I can understand what Israel Khan is doing, although when you get to the details, I can't necessarily agree with him, right? Because I don't think his argument is his sole motivation with regards to what happened with Marcia Cesar Ayers, and she herself did the wrong thing and is not blameless in the situation, and thus does not deserve to be treated in a manner of which she faces no consequence or can seek redress for what happened to her in totality. So the potential use of legal actions as tools for political intimidation, for the most part, I think one could argue it has failed. If any attempt has been made, for the most part, yes, there was the Piarco case, but really, did that do anything to Basil Pandey as a politician? I would argue not. And part of that case was in the States, not even here locally. There were many other situations, including a failed deal that I believe to some extent former Attorney General Faris Al-Rawi was involved with. I can't remember, I think it was the Vincent Nelson situation, where that fell through. That tends to be the norm right now. So ironically, we have the reverse problem. It's not going to be used as a political intimidation because it's not effective. The reverse problem is we're not seeing the criminal justice system being used as political intimidation. We're seeing an ineffective criminal justice system essentially being unable to rein in corruption and hold those politicians who may have engaged in corrupt acts to account. So we're not there yet. Maybe if this was India, then maybe it would be a whole different conversation, right? Well, we don't, our washing machine, our government washing machines don't work that well. I think whoever maintains the PTSD buses is maintaining that washing machine. That's why we don't have to worry about it. Anyway, that maybe might be a little bit too far on the analogy. But we'll end the show there. We're way over time. So I'd like to thank Inspector Calendar for joining me to have this conversation, which I think this is just one of those things where it's easy to underestimate because, you know, the dam hasn't burst yet. Right. But it's one of those things that, well, nobody wants to see the dam burst. When the dam bursts and everybody a flood, then it's all over. You can't reverse that. If the violence breaks out, you know, it's hard to put that genie back in the bottle. So thank you for joining us. I hope this is one of those things that the public hears, not like Facebook Marketplace, sorry to put Facebook on blast, but Facebook Marketplace and the warnings that the TTPS constantly gives us with regards to scam and fraud, and yet people over and over, and yet people still walk into it. I don't know. Thanks to the comments, thanks to the caller. It is election season. I understand people might be fed up of the political topics, but it is what it is. And maybe we'll all breathe a sigh of relief when everything is over, or maybe we won't. Fingers crossed, folks. So I'll just remind you to have a good day, make it so, put your best foot forward, and you could do so by, one, remembering your allegiance to this republic and to each other, your fellow citizens, regardless of political affiliation. It's nice to be nice. To everyone you meet today, stay safe. We'll see each other tomorrow. Bye-bye.
WESN.
My name is Dr. Joanne Williams-Carroll, and I am the Director of Behavioral and Mental Health at the Community Hospital. At the Community Hospital, we believe in nurturing mind, body, and soul. Through our counseling and chaplaincy program, we will provide you with support and strength you need to help with your mental and emotional well-being. Give us a call.
The Community Hospital of Seventh-day Adventist,
where good private health care is affordable.